Are you getting all the clues of your ancestor in that census record? Are you missing vital community clues within that census record? I'm going to be sharing with you what you might be missing about your ancestors' community in today's video. Hey there, I'm Lisa Lisson with Are You My Cousin? And this YouTube channel is designed to help you find your ancestors, grow your family tree, but not be overwhelmed in the process. So if it sounds like your cup of tea, you are in the right place. Okay, so you have found your ancestor in that census record, and it is time to celebrate. Absolutely. We want to give a little short genealogy happy dance, but before we move on to that next census record, to that next generation back, we want to make sure we're getting all the clues within that census. I want to encourage you that you take the next steps in learning about your ancestors' community before you move on. Because the better you understand your ancestors' community and what their day-to-day life looked like and what was influencing them on a day-to-day basis and in major life decisions, the better able you will be to track them through the records. So while you're on that page where you found your ancestor, make sure you take note at the very top of that census record and take a look and see what township they were in, how is it labeled, what county, obviously what state, but you want to make sure you're paying attention to the townships that are there because these change as states and counties grew, boundaries changed over time. So you want to make sure you make a note of that so that going forward, you'll be able to compare, did your ancestor move or was it more a thing of where county boundaries changed? So you want to make sure you're making note of the exact location. Everything that is in that top part of that census, whether it's the 1790 census, which didn't have a whole lot, I guarantee you, or the 1950, which had a lot more information. You want to make sure you're documenting not just had a household and all the family members in that, but make sure you're documenting all that information at the top so you know the exact location within that county and within that census that your ancestors appear. Once you know where they lived, what township or what county, and again, that very specific township, then add to your research plan to research the history, learn a little bit about that, research what locally was going on at the time that your ancestors lived there, whether that is through published history books, whether that is through the newspapers that might be available for that small area. Those are the resources that you're going to want to go to understand the history about that location. Now, if you love to dig into the census records in search of your ancestors, be sure and hit the like button and let me know, because I know I'm not the only one. Next up, when it comes to learning about the communities and the places where your ancestors lived, the census records can give you a lot of information by comparing the data across the census records. So what your ancestors' community may have looked like in, say, 1880, compared to what that community in that same area that he or she lived in 1900, could be quite different in 20 years. Or maybe you go to 1910, so 30 years later, the makeup of the community can change. And that's important for you as a researcher to understand how society and how culture was changing within an area where your ancestor lived. That can help you understand things such as why they stayed maybe in an area that was changing, or maybe why they actually left the area because an area was changing. So you want to compare the communities across the decades through those census records. What you might see is a significant change in size of a community. It may grow quite a bit. Maybe you're seeing actually a decline in population and that community has shrunk quite significantly over the years. That would tell you, maybe there's an economic issue going on here. Let me look at that. Let me see why people are leaving the area and perhaps potentially where people might be going. So it gives you an idea of what's happening within that community. Next up, what you want to look for in that census record are patterns within the census data. So one of the things that I particularly will look at when I'm reading a census for my ancestors, once I find them, I typically will read 5 pages back and 5 pages forward. First off, I'm looking for other relatives. I'm looking for collateral ancestors that are within those pages. But what that does for me is it allows me to see who's in that community. Who are the surnames, which may come up later in other research? What kinds of occupations I'm looking at? What are the predominant occupations? Am I looking at mostly farmers? Am I looking at one or two large farmers, and that it appears that much of the county, many of the individuals in the counties maybe work for one or two of those larger farmers, for those southern rural roots that I have so many of. But maybe I'm looking at, if you're researching, say, in a large city, are you seeing common occupations? So for example, if you see that the individuals in the area where your ancestor lived on that census record are predominantly working in one particular type of occupation or industry, such as manufacturing or mining, you can infer that that community is likely shaped by that particular industry. So you can go and research working conditions, the social life of people who worked in these particular types of jobs. You can learn about their daily lives. You can also learn if there are other records that document the workers in that particular industry. One of the ways to learn more about your ancestors' community and use that information in your research is to take a look at perhaps where people were from. So oftentimes I look at certainly my family in the grouping, but I'm going to be looking at the pages within that census district, and I'm looking to see certainly what types of work they were doing, as I mentioned, but I'm also looking to see predominantly maybe where people were from or where they were born. Are they local? Is this an area where generations have stayed for a long time? Or is this a community that's in flux? And I'm seeing perhaps a large number of German immigrants in that community. Well, that might indicate to me that I need to look at that community. Maybe my ancestor is of German descent. And if they are, they're in a community of other like-minded immigrants. And so let me take a look. Let me take a look at what is important to them. Let me see what kinds of newspapers they might have had. Let me see where they likely worship together. These can all influence my particular ancestor, and I want to make sure that I'm exploring that side of the community as well. Now, one of the things to help you learn about your ancestors' community when it comes to census records is actually the non-population schedules, the manufacturing schedule, as well as the agricultural census. I actually find the agricultural schedule very helpful, particularly for those who are researching, obviously, predominantly rural ancestors who are farmers, like much of my research is. And because what that can tell me, what kind of land they had. Was it, how much land did they have? How much of it was actually usable? It can tell me what kinds of crops they grew, what kinds of livestock they might have had. It can also tell me the value, which is a really interesting thing to look at, particularly when you're researching, perhaps if you have ancestors in the southern US, when you're researching farmers back during pre and post Civil War times, you can see the changes, the economic changes that have often occurred through that wartime. It's very important to put that agricultural census if it exists, because again, remember, those were only taken during the 1850 to 1880. So put that alongside the population census or the population schedule, and you can get a lot of information about your ancestor, not only just who they are, who's in the household, but you can get quite a bit of good information about their farm and about where they lived with that, as well as their neighbors and the other predominantly larger or smaller farmers in the area. So as we've covered these topics, what I really want you to think about, if you don't remember anything else from this, I want you to take your time in that census record and document your family as a unit, absolutely. But spend some time reading the previous pages, spend some time reading the pages that come after, looking at the makeup of the community around your ancestor. What kinds of jobs were common? What kinds of origins are common? Is this an immigrant population where you have a large number of folks who have fled their country or immigrated from their country and are settling in your area? Are you looking at a growing community across the decades, or are you looking at a community that is in decline across the decades, indicating they've gone somewhere? People are leaving for a reason, and they're probably very likely going to similar areas. So that can give you clues that you can put onto your research plan to seek out your ancestor along those migration patterns. Okay, so let's think about the tips for getting the most out of your census research when it comes to looking and learning about your ancestors' community. So one of the first things I want you to think about is really the limitations of that census, because the census obviously was taken by humans, and those census takers could make mistakes. As well as those census takers, oftentimes their handwriting was not that great, as we have all seen at some point or another, so it's difficult to read. And there are instances where things didn't survive. Certainly the 1890 census didn't survive, but there are other small pockets of loss, the county levels, where census records could have been lost. I've experienced that in my own research. So there are a few limitations, but if you're missing that population census, then perhaps if you're in the right time period, 1850 to 1880, take a peek to see one of the non-population schedules, such as that agricultural schedule can give you a hand. Another tip that I would offer you about learning about your ancestors' community would be to use a timeline. By tracking your ancestors' movement over time in that census record, you can learn about their migrations and you can learn about those communities. For example, if you say that your ancestor moved from one county or state to another in the 1880 census, you can research the social and economic conditions that may have influenced them to make that move. Now, the other tip that I would leave with you with is, as you are doing your research, keep your research plan open on the computer or right beside you, because as you learn clues, as questions come up, as you see the potential patterns that emerging out of those census records about your ancestor and about their communities, you're going to have questions that you want to follow up on. Go ahead and write them down on that research plan. Do not trust them to your memory, and because once you're distracted on another research project, you are going to forget. Or maybe that's just me. I'm going to forget if I don't write it down. So I keep that research plan close by so that then I can go ahead and add that. And then the next time I sit down to work on that particular project, I know where my thoughts were and I'm ready to go for it. Okay, so if you would like to learn more about census records, if you'd like to learn more about getting more out of your census record research, be sure and watch the video on your screen now.